since the revelation of first fruits, new creation, new man. By the way, it is in the scripture, Glenn. It's in Ephesians 2:15 and Ephesians 4:24. And it's in the literal translation, the word new man. So it accompanies the other term, new creation, which goes along with the word remnant, which goes along with first fruits and goes along with man-child. Uh, these are the identifications in different levels and different expressions. And uh, I'm coming to realize that once the revelation of being born again has become your new enlightenment, even though you don't know how to express it, it's an inherent desire to share it, even when you don't know much about it. That inherent desire to share originates in the Father. And the Father wanted to share and wants to share his life with individuals outside of himself. And obviously, he knows that unless he gives them a part of himself, they will never come into the knowledge of who he is and what he wants to do with them. Fellowship. Uh, just like you have all of us have high school friends and associates, and some of them you feel drawn to share with them. Unless they have that experience of God in them, they can't understand God. I think that relates to some of the scriptures that we've talked about is that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Another one is the Lord said unto my Lord, sit at my right hand. Unless you are born from above. And so being begotten of God comes with this inertia, this hunger and thirst to share the transformation that is taking place in all of us. I don't know if it should have been called good news. It should have been called the most marvelous, fantastic news in the universe. God has given himself to me. You're lost in the world. You don't know the end from the beginning. You don't know the beginning from the end. You don't even know why you're here. You don't have a purpose. other than to work and pay bills. And sooner or later that comes to an end. And then all of a sudden, we Gentiles who have no covenant with God at all, such as being born an Israelite or a Jew, from your birth, from your birth, you're inundated with God and all the attributes, like Sister Sandra read. You're well aware of them. You taught them from the time you can read or hear. And still, like Paul says, I've done it all. I attempted all of it, and yet I find myself lacking. I find an empty hole in myself. And then the Father introduces you to the only one that can bring you to the Father, and he introduces his Son to you. Now, this is a magnificent understanding because Gentiles have no roots. We're, like the Bible says, strangers, foreigners, alienated from God. And as the prophet said, I was found of a people who sought not after me. And so when this event takes place in us, we fumble over our own words trying to explain how exceeding and abundantly above all that we could ever imagine has taken place in us. And still we don't know what to do with it. We have tasted that the Lord is good. And we want everyone to feel what we feel. And yet we even stumble over our own feet trying to run after it when it's already in us. I only can recall the prophet that I've quoted many times. I'm going to do a marvelous, wonderful thing. And of all the people in the world, God has chosen us to experience Him. And yet, deep down inside of us, we can't hide or run away from the fact that we still want to share it with the rest of the world. I just want to get you to open up your heart to imagine that Jesus at the age of 12 said, I must, I need, I have to be about my Father's business. What was he doing? He was hanging around with Pharisees and scribes and lawyers at the age of 12. He was bubbling over with an experience that they couldn't fathom. They couldn't even imagine what this little boy was experiencing. He was the only light in the midst of darkness. And he has this affinity with humanity. He has this affinity with Jews. And God made him that way by bringing him through the seed of Abraham, that he could experience the human emotion. And on the other side, he has an enormous affinity with God as his father, not just as a God, but as his father. And these two worlds have collided with each other inside him. There were countless nights that Jesus cried himself to sleep because he loved God as his father and he loved man as himself. And that same inherent desire that we talked about early this morning, his immeasurable passion to share it, was breaking his heart. And God made him sit for about 18 years until that life began to ferment in him the wisdom and the knowledge and the understanding, the counsel, the might, and the fear of the Lord. And then he was ready. I'm certain that some of you have already experienced this over and over and over and over again. You're in a restaurant and you're sitting down. You've already ordered your food. And the maitre d' is walking, leading someone to a table in the restaurant. and they're in a wheelchair or a walker, or worse, walking with their their parent is a retarded child. And you sit there with your hands tied, the two worlds colliding. You know the power of God, and you know the world's suffering. And the spirit inside you is keeping your composure from doing something. Well, one of those days, hopefully not too long from now, God's going to release you. God's going to release us. And when the cork is popped from that wine that's been fermenting, no one will ever be able to stop it. And that's just one occasion in a restaurant. You're driving down the street on a highway, and you see this old woman or old man, raggedy clothes, filthy, been taken over by a demon spirit, destroyed his life. He has no life. On and on and on. So God has a time period of preparation. Moses had 40 years in the wilderness before God could use him. Joshua spent the same 40 years under Moses until he entered into the promised land, and more than likely he felt unassured of himself, judging from the first chapter. Be of good courage. As I was with Moses, so shall I be with you. Elijah and Elijah is the same story. The pattern remains the same. Jesus and his 12, they only had 3 years. And what made the difference was Pentecost. They were sitting at the table with the Lord, they were walking with him. Timothy and Titus and Philemon were known disciples of Paul, and We don't have any writings of Titus or Timothy. We have epistles written to them. Amen, Dollar. I hope everybody reads that. So the other night I was uh, praying. I was at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and all of these professing Christians that don't know the real Jesus. If any man comes and preach another Jesus other than the one that we have spoken, Paul says. There were many different characters of Jesus. By the time Paul was no longer Saul, and he was already maybe in his second missionary trip, possibly his third. I think the Epistle of Galatians was written, I think 30 years after Jesus' ascension. And you know what he had written in his first epistle, first chapter? If there is another gospel other than the gospel we have preached, if there is another Jesus other than the one that we have taught you, let him be a curse. And so there are many different Jesus out there. And you know what made that real to me is when I was building the Ark of the Covenant, getting ready to, and I went online and I pulled up pictures of the Ark. About 100 pictures showed up. And not one of them fit the description of Exodus 25. Not one of them. There was always something different, over embellished, misplaced items, the size, the materials. It was just so many different variations. And that's when the Lord said, it's indicative of how many Jesuses are being preached. And not one of them fits the gospel nor the epistles. So God has taken us, I won't say in the wilderness, but I believe God has taken us into a secret place, a very high secretive place. And the more God reveals to us, teaches us, but not only teaches us, but is opening us up for him to express and manifest himself in us many times, over and over, repetitive. In many cases, the same revelation over and over and over in different times and different places. That it becomes our nature. It becomes who we are. And it's no longer information. It's no longer knowledge only. It becomes I am. Perhaps then we'll be ready. or I should say, perhaps that's when the Father will say, I'm ready. Now, we've talked about the people in the outer court. We're not talking about people in the world. We're talking about people in the outer court. How they lack the true insight, and for certain reasons. They, we're just talking about people who are born again. We're not talking about people who are called Christians who are not born again. Christians who are born again. There's no doubt they are born again. And that born again experience is still at a very low, immature understanding. It's not much more than I'm going to go to heaven with Jesus. That's about, I mean, you can elaborate around that to some extent, but it has its limitations and ceilings. And those who are even baptized, because most born again Christians do understand you have to be baptized. Well, they barely understand what's going on inside of them to begin with. And then they go through baptism, of which is now just a church ordinance. And by the way, our communion is not called the Last Supper. It's the first supper. The Last Supper is the Passover. Supper being ended, he takes bread and wine and says something new is going to happen. So it's not the Last Supper, it's the first supper. The Last Supper is the Passover, of which he had. Of which they've made a religion over the communion service with no understanding. And so when they get saved and it is a genuine experience, born again experience, at least some of them realize that. And they get baptized, they once again, for lack of wisdom and knowledge and understanding, they've made that part of that religious ritual of being born again, join the church and get baptized into the church. And they still are staying out in the outer court. Because mainly they don't understand the atonement and its power, that by one sacrifice, the perfection of being born again with an incorruptible seed has already taken place. So by one sacrifice, he has forever perfected them that are sanctified, not being sanctified. They're already sanctified because of the divine spirit inside of them. And then it goes on to say in that context, is that he that sanctifieth, and they that have been sanctified by him who sanctified are one. Because it's the same spirit that sanctified us, Jesus Christ. I sanctify myself for their sake. So he that sanctified us is now a part of us, and he cannot separate himself from himself. when Jesus believes he is one with you, he cannot deny himself. If we deny him, he cannot deny himself. He abides faithful. That's why when Glenn was saying, well, sometimes this ugly monster of I'm still a sinner, which comes to all of us once in a while. And there's that little, little tinge, little tinge of doubt. And then he shines his discerning eyes on it for you to see. It's a demon spirit trying to creep in like a roach or an ant in the crevice of your house. And the light goes on and he exposes it for what it is because he cannot deny himself. Now, someone who has taken all of us into himself and gone through what he went through because he believed that he was one with us. How in the world can he turn his back on us now? All that pain and suffering would have been in vain. So he's not going to turn his back on you. He's gone through too much to embrace you and take you into himself. How can he deny himself? That's impossible. And that intimate knowledge that we just expressed is absent from those in the outer court. Jesus is hiding in a cloud somewhere in the universe, too far away. And some even say he's on his way. From where? From the edge of the galaxy? From the edge of the universe? Is he hiding someplace, somewhere? So God is mercifully and graciously preparing the new wine in you. It's got to ferment. It's got to sit there and go through a process of metamorphosis. He's saving the best wine for last. So this is what I believe is going to happen. The day, and I pray, comes soon, when God has set the table. He set the parameters. That we're going to set the creation free. And the whole world unconsciously is waiting for the manifestation of the sons of God. And all those that are in the outer court, they're going to get a chance. They're going to have an opportunity to hear the real gospel. And many of them are going to believe because God is going to cause the scenario where every born-again Christian will have to make a decision of being hot or remaining cold. But I say this, it won't be because of our lack of wisdom and knowledge, and it won't be a lack of passion in our hearts that all men would be saved and that would come to the knowledge of God and embrace Him as we have embraced Him, so we can have like precious faith with those who have fellowship with us. I wish I could say more, but all I can do is encourage you. Stay on the path. Don't break rank. Stay in the vision. God hasn't forgotten you in the caves. You haven't bowed your knee to Baal. Stay faithful even unto the end. So it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful moment that secret passion to share the Lord with someone will be satisfied. And you will never regret the time of patience, long suffering, endurance until God is ready. But He hasn't forgotten you. I'll close with that. If anybody have anything to add or share with us on the same lines, it's all open to anyone.
Yeah, I'd like to share. God has given me a term that helps me understand what this other Jesus is that's being preached in so many Christian churches. And that terminology is, and it may be offensive to some, and I don't care because it's opened up an understanding to me. He said it's called Christian Satanism. It's not Christ. It's got the name of Christian on it, but it is not Christ. And there are many who I believe, yes, that are caught up in it, as Tony says. I was raised in it, where it's uh, you die daily, and eventually, somehow, some way, you're going to make it. And there are people who live in that hope, and I believe this message is for, I know this message is for them, but I just want to share that with you that it's not just Christianity. I've had so many people say, well, but John down the street there, he says he's a Christian and he does such and such and such and such. Like that's supposed to somehow justify what they're doing wrong. And I said, that's not the same Jesus I'm talking about. It's the same pronunciation of the name, but it's not the same person. And I've heard that all my life. I'd work with people that sat in the front office and they proclaimed Jesus, and that they proclaimed that they were Christian. And other people would listen to them and then see how horrible they treated their compatriots or their fellow workers. And I said, it's not the same Jesus. It's not the same. And then God gave me that terminology. It's Christian Satanism. And to me, it made it very clear. I'll leave it at that.
Glenn, I have the same scenario situation. I have this two or three, especially one uh, that I grew up with. I met him. He was 10, I was 12. We lived 3 doors away from each other, and we worked together, cutting grass, and then flipping hamburgers together. And it took jobs, the same jobs, so we could stay together, and we had fun being together and everything. And he is what one would consider a moderate, devoted Catholic. I was a Catholic. I was an altar boy, too. So I know what his mindset is. And when I go to New Orleans, he insists that I stay with him at his house. And so I do. And every Sunday, he goes to church, Catholic church, right down the street, 3 blocks away. Same church I went to. And we sit across the table from each other every morning and have coffee and donuts. And we just talk about how much fun we had when we were kids and laugh about this and laugh about that. And I've prayed about how do I break into that Catholicism that he embraces as his faith without destroying our relationship. I know you know what I'm talking about. I heard you say it. So it's something that we all have as an experience. Every one of us have somebody that we would like to talk to about, that we embrace and love and have fun and enjoy being with them. And yet our tongue has this secret. And unless God turns the tongue loose, creates a scenario where hopefully it would be received without creating a controversy. Because if it's done wrong, you will have offended his faith in God. So Paul wrote about this in one of his epistles. He says, I won't lay a stumbling block against my brother who is weak in faith. I'll eat strong meat by myself. If all he can handle is herbs, then I won't offend him. I'll fellowship with him, but he cannot fellowship with me at my level. Jesus, just so you know, all of us know that Jesus had this acquaintance with this situation. It was simply expressed with much wisdom is much sorrow. I think it all encapsulates in the opening of one of the epistles. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believe might be saved. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But to as many as received him, he gave them the power to become sons of God. And God waited 3,000 or 4,000 years before he did that, before he opened the door to share his Son. You imagine the long suffering. God knows he's going to do it, but he's not going to do it until it's the right time. In the fullness of time, I think that's one of the expressions. In the fullness of time, God sent his only Son. So we use that as a pattern of God giving us a simulation of what he has suffered and has longed for. And then instead of using the people who should know it all, have roots, have been branches for thousands of years, he turns around and says, no, they're not going to receive me. I'm going to go to nations that don't even know me. And I will pour out my spirit upon them. And all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. So we too, like our Father, being about his business, we wait on Dad when he comes into the office one morning and says, I got some good news. I'm going to pour out my spirit upon all flesh. And so the first century church had that experience. He said, you go out now. So what has happened in church history is there were many people who were preaching a different kind of Jesus because of lack of true ministry, of true apostles and prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. Because there were many false prophets that went out, and it wasn't written in the Old Testament. It was now also written in the New Testament. When Peter says, there shall arise many false prophets and false teachers, which will lead people astray. Even Paul said that. He said, after my departure, there shall be many that will draw disciples to themselves, not sparing the flock like a wolf. And so this is being repeated now, because after the centuries, God knowing and spoke to the early apostles, it's going to slowly, true Christianity is going to slowly fade away. Just like it did in Old Testament Israel. Everything that God gave them as covenants and ordinances and judgments and prosperity and a land called them for themselves, and they slowly started worshiping other gods that were no gods at all. And so at the end of the age, this is biblical, historical patterns that we are experiencing. Satan has taken over Christianity. It's called the synagogue of Satan. In biblical terms, it's called anti-Christ. Christ and the anti, a different type of Christ that has taken over. A form of godliness, but has virtually no power for transformation. So what does God do? The same thing that he's done centuries and millenniums. He takes a group of people out of that segment and he sets them aside at a table and he teaches them all over what is true and what is deception. Now, I'm not talking about the deception of going to sitting in a bar room or soliciting things on the street, drugs or whatever it might be. No, that's not the deception. The deception is in the church. Like in the Old Testament, the priests started worshiping and burning incense to idols that were already set up in the temple. At least that's what Ezekiel said. They were burning incense in the temple to idols, false gods and goddesses. So that's what's happening today. But before the wrath of God be released on all that ungodliness, an enormous amount of compassion, love, and grace is what's going to turn them. It's mercy and truth is iniquity purged. So prepare yourself to speak the truth in love. Practice it. Perfect it. Because that's the only way their hearts are going to turn. That's why when they said of Jesus, we've never heard a man speak like this before. He has amazing words. The truth he speaks is full of grace. Gracious words. You can look it up. All the accolades they said of Jesus, because he didn't come to condemn the world, he came to the world be saved by him. However, that's going to turn when God says enough is enough. And his wrath will believe to come upon all those that believe not the gospel, who trodden underfoot the grace of Jesus Christ. Anybody have any questions or thoughts on these lines?